The second round commenced with both fighters understanding that grappling would likely determine the ultimate outcome of their confrontation. Marcus's confidence was evident as he moved forward, knowing that his size and strength advantages would be most pronounced in close-quarters combat. Sarah remained poised and alert, prepared to implement the ground fighting strategies she had developed specifically for this type of challenge. Marcus initiated the grappling phase with a powerful takedown attempt, using his wrestling background and physical superiority to drive Sarah toward the mat. His technique was sound and his execution powerful, representing exactly the type of approach that had overwhelmed countless opponents throughout his career. Sarah's response revealed the sophisticated nature of her ground fighting preparation. Rather than attempting to match Marcus's strength or resist his takedown directly, she used his momentum and positioning to execute a counter that surprised both Marcus and the observing crowd. What had appeared to be Marcus's dominant takedown suddenly became Sarah's opportunity for a reversal. The technical precision of Sarah's counter was breathtaking. She used principles from multiple martial arts disciplines, combining elements of judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and wrestling to create a defensive sequence that not only neutralized Marcus's attack, but established her own positional advantage. The crowd erupted in amazed murmurs as they witnessed technique triumphing over raw power. Marcus found himself in an unfamiliar position, defending against submissions from an opponent he had expected to control completely. Sarah's ground game was even more sophisticated than her striking, featuring chains of attacks that flowed seamlessly from one technique to another. Each time Marcus escaped one submission attempt, he found himself facing another equally dangerous threat. The psychological impact on Marcus was significant. For years, his ground fighting had been his most dominant area, where his physical advantages were most pronounced and his technical skills most effective. Discovering that Sarah could not only match him in this arena, but potentially exceed his capabilities was profoundly unsettling. Sarah continued to demonstrate technical excellence that bordered on artistic. Her submission attempts were perfectly timed and executed with mechanical precision, each technique building on the previous to create a web of threats that Marcus struggled to defend. Her ability to transition between different attacks while maintaining control was remarkable even to the experienced instructors observing the evaluation. As the second round progressed, Marcus began to adapt his strategy. His extensive experience and competitive intelligence allowed him to recognize patterns in Sarah's attack sequences and develop defensive responses. While he couldn't match her technical sophistication, his understanding of fundamental grappling principles helped him avoid the most dangerous submission attempts. The adaptation demonstrated Marcus's legitimate skills and experience. Despite being outclassed technically, he managed to survive Sarah's initial onslaught and begin mounting his own offensive sequences. His strength and size advantages, while not decisive, provided enough of an edge to prevent Sarah from achieving a quick victory. The round concluded with Sarah having clearly dominated the grappling exchanges without achieving a definitive finish. Her technical superiority was undeniable, but Marcus's defensive awareness and physical attributes had prevented her from converting her advantages into a decisive victory. The evaluation remained competitive, though the momentum had shifted noticeably in Sarah's favor. During the rest period before the final round, the atmosphere in the training facility was electric with anticipation. Observers had witnessed exceptional displays of skill from both fighters, but the ultimate outcome remained uncertain. The open format final round would allow both fighters to demonstrate their complete range of capabilities. Marcus used the rest period for intense mental preparation, knowing that his reputation and pride depended on a strong performance in the final round. His confidence had been shaken by Sarah's technical dominance in the grappling phase, but his competitive experience helped him refocus on his strengths and advantages. Sarah remained calm and composed during the break, her breathing controlled and her focus absolute. She had proven her capabilities in both striking and grappling phases, establishing herself as a legitimate threat to Marcus's dominance. The final round represented an opportunity to demonstrate the complete integration of her skills. The third and final round began with both fighters understanding that this phase would determine the evaluation's outcome. Marcus needed to reassert his dominance and prove that his experience and physical advantages could overcome Sarah's technical superiority. Sarah sought to continue implementing her tactical plan while remaining alert to Marcus's inevitable desperate attempts to establish control. The early exchanges of the final round were cautious, with both fighters respecting their opponent's capabilities while looking for opportunities to impose their preferred tactical approach. Marcus attempted to use his reach and power advantages to control distance, while Sarah sought to create the angles and positioning that would enable her most effective techniques. As the round progressed, the intensity increased dramatically. Both fighters began to press their advantages more aggressively, leading to increasingly dynamic exchanges that showcased their exceptional capabilities. The crowd watched in fascinated silence as two elite warriors tested their skills against each other at the highest level. Marcus's experience began to show as he adapted his strategy to counter Sarah's technical approaches. His defensive awareness improved throughout the round, and he began to create opportunities for his own offensive sequences. The size and strength advantages that had been neutralized by Sarah's technique started to become factors in the competition. Sarah recognized Marcus's tactical adjustments and responded with innovations of her own. Her ability to adapt in real time demonstrated the depth of her training and the sophistication of her tactical thinking. She began to employ techniques and combinations that she had held in reserve, keeping Marcus off balance and unable to establish his preferred rhythm. The decisive moment came with approximately 90 seconds remaining in the final round. Marcus, growing desperate to achieve a definitive advantage, committed to an aggressive attack sequence that represented his best opportunity to overwhelm Sarah through superior strength and intimidation. The attack was powerful and well executed, forcing Sarah to defend against multiple threats while being driven backward toward the edge of the training area. For several seconds, it appeared that Marcus might finally achieve the dominant position his experience and reputation suggested he deserved. Sarah's response to this crisis would become legendary in the annals of Fort Braxton training history. Rather than panic or attempt to match Marcus's aggression, she implemented a defensive strategy so sophisticated and perfectly executed that observers would debate its technical merits for years afterward. Using a combination of footwork, timing, and technique that seemed to bend the laws of physics, Sarah not only defended Marcus's assault, but created an opportunity for a counter that caught him completely off guard. The sequence was so quick and unexpected that many observers missed the crucial details on first viewing. In less than 3 seconds, Sarah transformed what appeared to be Marcus's moment of triumph into his moment of defeat. The technical precision of her counter was breathtaking, combining elements from multiple martial arts disciplines into a seamless combination that left Marcus helpless on the training mat. The submission was applied with such clinical efficiency that Marcus had no opportunity to defend or escape. One moment he was pressing his attack with supreme confidence. The next moment he was tapping out to acknowledge defeat. The transition was so rapid that the crowd needed several seconds to process what they had witnessed. Master Sergeant Williams raised Sarah's arm to signal her victory, but the gesture was almost anticlimactic. The true impact of what had occurred was written in the stunned expressions of the observing soldiers and the shell-shocked demeanor of Marcus himself. Sarah had not just defeated the base's undefeated champion. She had done so in a manner that demonstrated clear technical and tactical superiority. The victory was decisive and undeniable, achieved through skill rather than luck or circumstance. The crowd's response was a mixture of amazement, respect, and disbelief. Soldiers who had witnessed Marcus's dominance for years struggled to accept that his unbeaten streak had ended so definitively. The technical excellence of Sarah's victory left no room for excuses or alternative explanations. Marcus remained on the training mat for several moments after the match concluded, processing the reality of his first defeat in over 15 years of competition. The psychological impact was profound, forcing him to confront assumptions about his abilities that had remained unchallenged for his entire adult life. When Marcus finally rose from the mat, his response demonstrated the character that had made him a respected leader despite his recent arrogance. He approached Sarah with genuine respect, acknowledging her superior performance and offering congratulations without reservation or excuse. "That was incredible," Marcus said, his voice carrying newfound humility. "I've never faced anyone with your level of technical skill. You earned this victory completely." Sarah accepted the acknowledgement graciously, her respect for Marcus's abilities and experience evident in her response. "You're an exceptional fighter, Sergeant. Your experience and adaptability made this one of the most challenging matches I've ever had." The exchange between the two fighters set the tone for the aftermath of their historic confrontation. Rather than creating lasting animosity, the evaluation had established mutual respect based on demonstrated capabilities and professional conduct. Colonel Patterson addressed the assembled soldiers following the conclusion of the evaluation. His comments emphasized the value of the exercise as a learning experience and the exemplary conduct demonstrated by both participants. The colonel also announced that detailed analysis of the match would be incorporated into future training programs. "Today we witnessed an exceptional demonstration of combat skills and tactical thinking," Colonel Patterson stated. Both soldiers represented the highest standards of military professionalism and competitive excellence. Captain Chin's victory was achieved through superior technique and strategic preparation, while Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated the adaptability and resilience that define elite warriors. The colonel's analysis continued with technical observations about the strategies and techniques employed by both fighters. The evaluation had provided valuable insights into advanced combat methodologies that would benefit the entire training program. As the crowd dispersed and normal base operations resumed, the impact of Sarah's victory began to ripple throughout Fort Braxton. Her achievement had implications that extended far beyond individual recognition, influencing perceptions about combat effectiveness, training methodologies, and the integration of technical innovation with traditional military approaches. Sarah's integration into the base community was now complete, established through demonstrated excellence rather than administrative assignment. Her willingness to share knowledge and help others improve their capabilities had already earned respect, but her victory over Marcus established her credibility as someone worthy of the highest level of professional regard. Marcus, meanwhile, faced the challenge of redefining his identity and role within the unit. His defeat had been decisive, but his response to that defeat would ultimately determine his future effectiveness and leadership potential. The humility and grace he had shown immediately after the match suggested positive possibilities for his continued development. In the days following the evaluation, Sarah found herself inundated with requests for training assistance and technical guidance. Soldiers throughout the base sought to learn from her expertise, recognizing an opportunity to improve their own capabilities under the tutelage of someone who had proven exceptional abilities. Sarah embraced this teaching role enthusiastically, understanding that her success created opportunities to contribute to the collective improvement of the unit. She developed informal training sessions that focused on technical refinement and strategic thinking, sharing the knowledge and insights that had made her victory possible. Marcus also underwent a transformation in the aftermath of his defeat. The humbling experience forced him to reconsider his approach to training and competition, leading him to seek opportunities for technical improvement and tactical development. His request to train under Sarah's guidance was both surprising and admirable. The training sessions that followed became legendary at Fort Braxton, featuring two exceptional fighters working together to push the boundaries of combat effectiveness. Sarah's technical expertise combined with Marcus's experience and physical capabilities created a synergy that benefited both participants and observing soldiers. The transformation of Marcus from defeated opponent to dedicated student demonstrated the first shot shattered the driver's side window, sending tiny cubes of safety glass cascading into Rebecca's lap like deadly confetti. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the sedan, a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the tree-lined street and bounce between the quiet houses where families were just beginning their morning routines. Marcus had pulled the trigger almost without conscious thought, his finger responding to months of accumulated rage rather than any deliberate decision to fire. The recoil surprised him, jerking his hand upward and sending the bullet high and to the right, missing Rebecca's head by mere inches. The shot embedded itself in the passenger seat headrest, leaving a smoking hole in the fabric. Rebecca screamed and threw herself sideways, desperately trying to make herself a smaller target while fumbling for the door handle on the passenger side. Her medical training kicked in automatically, cataloging her injuries with clinical detachment even as terror flooded her system. Superficial cuts from flying glass, possible bruised ribs from the airbag deployment, elevated heart rate, and blood pressure from acute stress response. She was alive, she was functional, and she needed to get out of this car immediately. The second shot came before she could fully process the first. This one struck the dashboard just above the radio, sending plastic fragments exploding across the interior of the vehicle. Marcus was firing without aiming now, his vision blurred by tears of rage and frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She was supposed to listen, supposed to understand, supposed to admit what she had done to his daughter. "Sarah Thompson," he shouted through the shattered window, his voice cracking with emotion. "March 15th. You remember her? You remember letting my little girl die?" Rebecca froze at the mention of the name and date. Sarah Thompson. The motorcycle accident. The young woman they had fought so hard to save, whose injuries had been too severe for any earthly intervention. In an instant, she understood exactly who was attacking her and why. This wasn't random violence. This was a father's grief transformed into something deadly and desperate. "I remember Sarah," Rebecca called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "We did everything we could for her. Everything." The third shot answered her, punching through the roof of the car just above her head. Marcus was moving around the vehicle now, trying to get a better angle, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. Rebecca could hear him sobbing between the gunshots, great wrenching sounds that spoke of profound loss and unprocessed trauma. Down the street, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was watering her rose garden when the first shot rang out. At 73, she had lived through enough to recognize the sound of gunfire, and she immediately dropped her watering can and hurried inside to call 911. Her arthritic fingers trembled as she dialed, and she had to repeat the address twice for the dispatcher who was having trouble hearing her over the sound of additional shots. "There's a man with a gun shooting at someone's car on Maple Street," Eleanor reported, peering through her lace curtains at the scene unfolding 3 houses down. "Send police and an ambulance. Hurry, please." The 911 dispatcher, a calm-voiced woman named Janet Morrison, had been handling emergency calls for 12 years, but the urgency in Eleanor's voice sent chills down her spine. "Ma'am, are you in a safe location? Can you see the shooter? He's standing right there in the middle of the street," Eleanor whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow draw Marcus's attention. "He's got a gun pointed at a blue car. There's someone inside. Oh God, he's going to kill them." Miles away, Officer David Chun was finishing his routine patrol of the downtown business district when the call came through his radio. "Active shooter, Maple Street, shots fired, victim possibly trapped in vehicle." He hit his lights and sirens immediately, his patrol car's powerful engine roaring to life as he pressed the accelerator to the floor. David had been a police officer for 8 years, had responded to domestic disputes and bar fights and drug deals gone wrong. But active shooter calls were different. They carried the weight of potential tragedy, the knowledge that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. As he raced through the morning traffic, weaving between cars and running red lights, he thought about his own daughter, who was Sarah Thompson's age when she died. Back on Maple Street, Rebecca had managed to unlock the passenger door and was attempting to crawl out of the wrecked sedan when the fourth shot shattered the rear window. Glass rained down on her back and shoulders as she tumbled onto the asphalt, her scrubs tearing on the rough pavement. She could taste blood in her mouth and feel it running down her face from multiple small cuts, but she was alive and mobile. Marcus rounded the back of the car, the revolver held in both hands now, trying to steady his aim through the tears that streamed down his cheeks. Rebecca was on the ground, vulnerable and exposed, and for a moment he hesitated. She looked so small lying there, so human and fragile. This wasn't the cold, calculating monster he had built up in his mind over the past 6 months. This was just a person, someone's daughter, someone who was probably somebody's friend. But then, The image of Sarah in her hospital bed flooded back into his consciousness. His little girl, broken and bleeding, her life slipping away while this woman stood by and did nothing. The rage returned full force, overwhelming whatever vestige of humanity had momentarily surfaced. "You could have saved her," Marcus said, his voice now deadly quiet. "You had the training, the equipment, everything you needed. But you didn't care enough to try." Rebecca struggled to her knees, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Blood from her head wound had soaked through her blonde hair, and her scrubs were torn and dirty from crawling across the pavement. But her voice remained calm and professional, drawing on years of experience talking to people in crisis. "Mr. Thompson, I know you're in pain. I know losing Sarah has destroyed your world. But killing me won't bring her back. It won't change what happened that night. Don't you dare say her name," Marcus snarled, raising the gun again. "Don't you dare pretend you care about her now." The fifth shot was meant to be the last. Marcus aimed carefully this time, centering the barrel on Rebecca's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger with deliberate intent. This would be justice for Sarah, punishment for the person who had failed his daughter when she needed help the most. But as his finger completed its motion, as the hammer fell, and the firing pin struck the cartridge, something unexpected happened. The image that flashed through his mind wasn't Sarah in her hospital bed or Rebecca standing over her with callous indifference. Instead, he saw Sarah as she had been just a week before the accident, laughing at something stupid he had said while they worked together in the garage, her hands covered in motor oil as she helped him rebuild an engine. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. His daughter, who had spent her Saturdays volunteering at an animal shelter and her summers working as a camp counselor for underprivileged children, would never have wanted her death to be the reason for someone else's murder. She would have been horrified to know that her father was pointing a gun at another human being in her name. The fifth shot went wide, striking the pavement beside Rebecca's knee and sending chips of concrete flying in all directions. Marcus staggered backward as if he had been punched, the gun suddenly, feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. What was he doing? What kind of monster had his grief turned him into? Rebecca saw the change in his expression and recognized the moment of clarity that sometimes came to people in crisis. She had seen it before in the emergency department, when patients or family members suddenly realized they were making terrible decisions based on fear or pain or desperation. "She loved you very much," Rebecca said quietly, not moving from her position on the ground. "Sarah talked about you while we were treating her. Even through all the pain, she was worried about how you and her mother would handle losing her." Marcus's knees buckled, and he sank down onto the asphalt, the gun falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattering across the pavement. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the street in terrified silence. And suddenly, there were sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "I loved her so much," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was everything to me. Everything." Rebecca slowly crawled toward him, her medical instincts overriding her fear and self-preservation. This man had just tried to kill her, had fired 5 shots in her direction, but she could see that he was in psychiatric crisis and needed help. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something much more fragile and damaged. "I know you did," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "That love is the most real thing in the world." Sarah knew it too. She felt it even at the end. The first police car rounded the corner just as Marcus collapsed completely, great heaving sobs racking his body as 6 months of suppressed grief finally found its voice. Officer David Chun approached the scene with his weapon drawn, but lowered it when he saw that the immediate threat had passed. The shooter was on the ground, disarmed and completely broken, while the intended victim was attempting to provide comfort rather than seeking revenge. "Ma'am, are you injured?" David called out, keeping his distance until backup arrived. "Do you need medical attention?" Rebecca looked up at the officer, suddenly aware of the blood on her face and the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm Dr. Martinez from Riverside Medical. I need to stay with this patient until the paramedics arrive. He's having a severe psychological breakdown." More police cars were arriving now, along with an ambulance and a fire truck, their red and blue lights painting the quiet residential street in emergency colors. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion, but kept back by police barriers. The morning that had started so peacefully had been transformed into a crime scene that would be talked about for years to come. Paramedic Steve Wilson jumped out of the ambulance and immediately began assessing the situation. He recognized Rebecca from the hospital and could see that she was injured but stable. The man on the ground appeared to be in severe emotional distress, but showed no signs of physical trauma. "Doc, what happened here?" Steve asked as he began checking Rebecca's wounds. Detective Sarah Hawkins arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the shooting stopped, her experienced eyes immediately cataloging the evidence scattered across Maple Street. 5 brass shell casings gleamed in the morning sunlight, each one marking a moment when Marcus Thompson had pulled the trigger in desperate rage. The blue sedan sat crumpled against the pickup truck, its windows shattered and interior peppered with bullet holes that told the story of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. Sarah had worked violent crimes for 15 years, had seen domestic shootings and gang violence and senseless acts of brutality that defied explanation. But something about this scene felt different, more complex than the usual clear-cut cases of assault with a deadly weapon. The shooter was sitting quietly in a patrol car, making no attempt to resist arrest or claim innocence. The victim, despite being wounded and traumatized, had refused to leave his side until the paramedics arrived. "What do we have?" Sarah asked Officer David Chun, who had been first on scene and was now coordinating the initial response. Marcus Thompson, age 47, opened fire on Dr. Rebecca Martinez as she was driving home from work, David reported, consulting his notes. 5 shots fired from a .38 revolver, no fatalities, minor injuries to the victim from broken glass and vehicle collision. Thompson surrendered voluntarily and has been cooperative since arrest. Sarah nodded and walked over to examine the damaged vehicles more closely. The impact pattern suggested that Thompson had deliberately caused the collision, forcing Martinez to stop so he could confront her. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It had been planned and executed with specific intent. "Do we know why Thompson targeted Dr. Martinez?" Sarah asked. "Working on that now." Thompson mentioned a name while he was shooting, Sarah Thompson. "Probably his daughter. We're checking hospital records to see if there's a connection." Detective Hawkins approached the police cruiser where Marcus sat with his hands cuffed behind his back. Through the window, she could see a middle-aged man who looked like he hadn't slept in months. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and there was a hollow quality to his expression that spoke of profound loss. This wasn't the face of a hardened criminal or a violent psychopath. This was someone who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, opening the car door and crouching down to his level. "I'm Detective Hawkins. I need to ask you some questions about what happened here this morning." Marcus looked up at her with eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I tried to kill her," he said quietly. "Dr. Martinez. I fired 5 shots at her because I thought she let my daughter die." The confession was delivered without emotion, as if Marcus was simply stating a fact about the weather. Sarah had been expecting denials or demands for a lawyer or claims of self-defense. Direct admission of guilt was unusual enough to be noteworthy. "Tell me about your daughter," Sarah said, her voice gentle but professional. The question opened a floodgate. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus told Detective Hawkins about Sarah Thompson, about the daughter who had been the center of his universe since the day she was born. He spoke about her love of motorcycles and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about the way she could make him laugh even on his worst days, about the future they had planned together that would never come to pass. He also told her about the months since Sarah's death, about the sleepless nights, and the drinking, and the gradual dissolution of everything that had once given his life meaning. His wife had left him 3 months after the funeral, unable to cope with his increasing anger and depression. His business had suffered as he became unable to concentrate on anything except his daughter's death. Friends and family had tried to help, but grief had made him unreachable. "I started looking for someone to blame," Marcus admitted, his voice hoarse from crying. "The drunk driver was already in prison, and that didn't feel like enough. So I started researching the medical team that treated Sarah. Dr. Martinez's name was on all the reports." Sarah listened without judgment, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. She had worked enough cases involving grieving families to understand how loss could distort rational thinking, how the need for answers could transform into a need for revenge. Meanwhile, Rebecca Martinez was being treated in the emergency department of the same hospital where she worked. The irony wasn't lost on her as her colleagues cleaned her wounds and checked for signs of concussion. Dr. James Patterson, the head of emergency medicine, had insisted on examining her personally despite her protests that the injuries were minor. "You were nearly killed this morning," James said as he sutured a particularly deep cut on her forehead. "Minor injuries are the least of our concerns right now." Rebecca winced as the needle pierced her skin, more from exhaustion than physical pain. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. She had spent her career treating victims of violence, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different from anything she had imagined. "I want to see his medical records," she said suddenly. James paused in his suturing. "Whose records?" "Sarah Thompson, the girl who died 6 months ago. Her father thinks we made mistakes treating her. I need to review the case." "Rebecca, you're in shock. You need to rest and let the police handle this. Reviewing old cases isn't going to help anyone right now." But Rebecca was already reaching for her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number for medical records. The need to understand what had driven Marcus Thompson to such desperate measures was overwhelming, even stronger than her own trauma and fear. Dr. Patterson gently took the phone from her hands. "At least let me finish patching you up before you start playing detective," he said. "The records aren't going anywhere." Back at the police station, Detective Hawkins was conducting a more formal interview with Marcus Thompson in one of the small, windowless rooms reserved for suspects. A court-appointed attorney sat beside him, a young public defender named Maria Santos who looked like she would rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Hawkins began, "you've waived your right to remain silent and agreed to speak with us about the events of this morning. I want to make sure you understand that anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Marcus nodded. "I understand. I want to tell the truth about what I did." "In your own words, describe what happened on Maple Street this morning." Marcus took a deep breath and began his confession. He described following Dr. Martinez from the hospital, planning to force her to stop so they could talk. He admitted to deliberately causing the collision and to pulling a gun when he thought she might escape. He recounted each of the 5 shots he fired, acknowledging that he had intended to kill her. "But something happened when I was about to fire the 6th shot," Marcus said, his voice breaking again. "I realized that Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. My little girl would have been horrified to know that I was trying to kill someone in her name." Detective Hawkins had heard thousands of confessions in her career, but few had affected her as deeply as Marcus Thompson's raw honesty. There was no attempt to minimize his actions or shift blame to others. He took full responsibility for what he had done, while also trying to explain the grief that had driven him to such extremes. "Mr. Thompson, were you under the influence of drugs or alcohol this morning?" she asked. "No, I haven't had a drink in 3 weeks." I wanted to be completely clear-headed when I confronted her. The admission made the crime even more serious from a legal standpoint. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment caused by intoxication. This was premeditated attempted murder, planned and executed with deliberate intent. Marcus could be looking at decades in prison. Maria Santos, the public defender, finally spoke up. "Detective, my client has been cooperative, but I think we've covered enough ground for today. He's clearly suffering from severe emotional distress related to his daughter's death." Detective Hawkins nodded and concluded the interview. As Marcus was led back to his holding cell, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than simple grief-driven violence. The relationship between Marcus and Dr. Martinez had changed dramatically during their confrontation on Maple Street. She had seen it in the way the doctor refused to leave his side, the way she held his hand even after he had tried to kill her. That afternoon, Rebecca finally gained access to Sarah Thompson's medical records. She reviewed every page with the intensity of a detective examining crime scene evidence, looking for any mistakes or oversights that might have contributed to the young woman's death. What she found was exactly what she had expected: a textbook case of trauma surgery performed under extremely difficult circumstances. Sarah had arrived at the hospital with massive internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and severe head trauma. The medical team had worked frantically to stabilize her condition, but the damage was simply too extensive. Even if she had been injured directly outside a major trauma center, with a full surgical team standing by, the outcome would likely have been the same. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon researching similar cases, looking for any evidence that different treatment protocols might have made a difference. She consulted with trauma surgeons from other hospitals, reviewed medical literature, and even contacted experts at nationally renowned medical centers. The consensus was unanimous. Sarah Thompson's injuries were non-survivable, and the emergency team at Riverside Medical had performed admirably under impossible circumstances. Armed with this information, Rebecca made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. Instead of focusing on her own recovery or pursuing maximum criminal penalties against Marcus Thompson, she decided to visit him in jail. The Riverside County Jail was a depressing concrete building that housed everyone from drunk drivers to violent felons. Rebecca had to pass through multiple security checkpoints and submit to a thorough search before being allowed into the visiting area. She had never been inside a jail before, and the atmosphere of desperation and resignation was almost overwhelming. Marcus looked up in shock when Rebecca entered the visiting room. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame, and he looked like he had aged 10 years since their confrontation that morning. The last person he had expected to see was the woman he had tried to murder. "Dr. Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Rebecca sat down across from him, separated by a thick sheet of reinforced glass. She had to speak through a small metal grate that made conversation difficult and impersonal. "I came here to talk to you about Sarah," she said. "I've spent the afternoon reviewing her medical records and consulting with trauma specialists from around the country." Marcus leaned forward, sudden hope flickering in his eyes. Maybe the doctor had found something, some error or oversight that could explain his daughter's death. "The truth is that we did everything humanly possible for Sarah that night," Rebecca continued. "Her injuries were so severe that even perfect medical care couldn't have saved her. I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth." The hope died in Marcus's eyes, replaced by the same hollow despair that had driven him to violence. But this time, instead of transforming into rage, the grief seemed to settle into something deeper and more permanent. "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I think I've always known. I just needed someone to blame because blaming the drunk driver wasn't enough. I needed it to be someone's fault, someone who was still alive and could be punished." They sat in silence for several minutes. Two people whose lives had been forever changed by a moment of violence born from unbearable loss. Rebecca studied Marcus's face and saw not the monster who had terrorized her that morning, but a broken man who had lost the most important thing in his life and didn't know how to survive the aftermath. "What happens now?" Marcus asked eventually. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and people whose lives had been touched by the events on Maple Street. Marcus Thompson sat at the defendant's table, wearing a navy blue suit that his sister had brought him for the trial. He looked healthier than he had in jail, having spent his time in custody attending grief counseling sessions and working with a psychiatrist to address his depression and rage. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. District Attorney Robert Pierce presented evidence of premeditation, including witness testimony about Marcus stalking Dr. Martinez and planning the attack for weeks. The damaged vehicles, bullet trajectories, and forensic evidence painted a clear picture of attempted murder. If convicted on all charges, Marcus faced up to 25 years in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," D.A. Pierce said during his opening statement, "this case is about a man who allowed his grief to transform him into something monstrous." Marcus Thompson planned and executed a deliberate attempt to murder Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a dedicated physician whose only crime was failing to perform a miracle. "We cannot allow personal tragedy to excuse violence against innocent people." The defense attorney, Maria Santos, had taken on the case despite the overwhelming evidence against her client. She had spent months interviewing Marcus, reviewing his psychological evaluations, and trying to understand how a previously law-abiding citizen could commit such a desperate act. Your Honor, Maria said during her opening statement, this case is indeed about grief, but it's also about a broken man who lost his way in the darkness of unimaginable loss. Marcus Thompson doesn't deny what he did, but we ask you to consider the circumstances that led to that terrible morning and to remember that justice isn't just about punishment. It's also about healing and redemption. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Rebecca Martinez took the witness stand. She had been subpoenaed by the prosecution to testify about the attack, but her testimony would prove to be far different from what DA Pierce had expected. Rebecca described the shooting in clinical detail, from the moment Marcus forced her off the road to the instant when he collapsed in grief and remorse. She spoke about her injuries, her fear, and the terror of having 5 bullets fired in her direction by a man consumed with rage. But she also spoke about something else that surprised everyone in the courtroom. During our confrontation, Mr. Thompson called out his daughter's name. Rebecca testified. When I realized who he was and why he was attacking me, I understood that this wasn't really about me at all. This was about a father who loved his child so much that losing her had destroyed his ability to think rationally. DA Pierce tried to redirect Rebecca's testimony toward the criminal nature of Marcus's actions, but she continued to speak about the human tragedy underlying the violence. I've spent the past 6 months visiting Mr. Thompson in jail, Rebecca said, causing a stir in the courtroom. Through our conversations, I've come to understand that the man who attacked me that morning wasn't the real Marcus Thompson. It was a distorted version of himself, created by grief and desperation and the inability to accept that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. The prosecutor objected, arguing that the victim's forgiveness was irrelevant to the criminal charges, but Judge Patricia Williams allowed Rebecca to continue her testimony. I'm not here to excuse what Mr. Thompson did, Rebecca said firmly. What he did was wrong, and it could have killed me. But I am here to tell you that people aren't defined by their worst moments, especially when those moments arise from unbearable pain. The Marcus Thompson I've gotten to know over the past 6 months is nothing like the man who pointed a gun at me. He's a grieving father who got lost in his own suffering and made terrible choices as a result. During cross-examination, Maria Santos asked Rebecca to describe her visits with Marcus in jail. Rebecca spoke about watching him work through his grief in healthy ways for the first time since Sarah's death. She described his participation in counseling programs and his growing understanding that his daughter would never have wanted him to hurt other people in her memory. Has Mr. Thompson expressed remorse for his actions? Maria asked. Every single time I've visited him, Rebecca replied. But more than that, he's worked to understand why he did what he did, so it can never happen again. He's committed himself to honoring Sarah's memory in positive ways, rather than destroying lives in her name. The next witness was Dr. James Patterson, Rebecca's colleague and supervisor at Riverside Medical Center. He testified about Sarah Thompson's treatment, confirming that the medical team had followed all appropriate protocols and that the young woman's injuries were non-survivable. Dr. Martinez and her team performed heroically that night, Dr. Patterson said. They worked for 47 minutes trying to save Sarah Thompson's life, using every available resource and technique. Her death was a tragedy, but it wasn't the result of medical negligence or inadequate care. Marcus's sister, Linda Thompson Hayes, testified on his behalf during the defense portion of the trial. She described the man Marcus had been before Sarah's death, a loving father and husband, a successful business owner who employed 12 people, a community volunteer who coached youth baseball, and donated his time to local charities. Marcus wasn't perfect, Linda said through tears, but he was a good man who was destroyed by losing the person who meant everything to him. Sarah wasn't just his daughter. She was his best friend, his business partner, his whole world. When she died, a part of him died too, and he didn't know how to keep living with that kind of pain. The prosecution called several witnesses to establish the premeditated nature of Marcus's attack. A coworker testified that Marcus had been asking questions about hospital schedules and staff rotations in the weeks before the shooting. A neighbor reported seeing Marcus sitting in his truck outside Dr. Martinez's apartment building on multiple occasions. A gun store owner confirmed that Marcus had purchased ammunition for his .38 revolver just 3 days before the attack. But the The defense countered with testimony from Dr. Sandra Reeves, a psychiatrist who had been treating Marcus while he was in custody. Dr. Reeves explained how untreated grief could manifest as rage and how the human mind sometimes created elaborate justifications for irrational behavior when faced with unbearable loss. Mr. Thompson was suffering from what we call complicated grief disorder, Dr. Reeves testified. This is a condition where the normal grieving process becomes stuck, leading to persistent yearning, anger, and difficulty accepting the death. In severe cases, it can lead to thoughts of revenge against anyone the grieving person perceives as responsible for their loss. In your professional opinion, Maria Santos asked, was Mr. Thompson capable of rational decision-making on the morning of the shooting? His judgment was severely compromised by his psychiatric condition, Dr. Reeves replied. He was acting on delusions about Dr. Martinez's role in his daughter's death, delusions that had been reinforced by months of untreated psychological distress. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from medical experts, ballistic specialists, and character witnesses. Throughout the proceedings, Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, often wiping away tears when Sarah's name was mentioned. He had insisted on pleading guilty to the charges, despite his attorney's advice to pursue an insanity defense. I did what I'm accused of, Marcus told Judge Williams during a pretrial hearing. I don't want to hide behind legal technicalities or claim that I wasn't responsible for my actions. I was wrong, and I need to face the consequences of what I did. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Marcus himself took the stand during the sentencing phase. Against the advice of both his attorney and the prosecutor, Judge Williams allowed him to address the court directly. Marcus spoke for nearly an hour about his daughter, about their relationship, and about the months of anguish that had led to his attack on Dr. Martinez. He didn't make excuses for his behavior or try to minimize the severity of his crimes. Instead, he spoke about taking responsibility for his actions and finding ways to honor Sarah's memory that would make her proud. Sarah was studying to become a veterinarian because she wanted to help living things, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. She would be horrified to know that her death led to violence against another person. Dr. Martinez is a healer, someone who dedicates her life to saving others. My daughter would have loved and respected her if they had met under different circumstances. Marcus also spoke about his visits with Rebecca in jail and how those conversations had helped him begin to heal from his grief in healthy ways. Dr. Martinez didn't have to forgive me, he said. She could have demanded maximum punishment and moved on with her life. But, instead, she chose to see me as a human being who was suffering, rather than a monster who had tried to kill her. That compassion saved my life just as surely as if she had performed emergency surgery. During the final week of the trial, Rebecca made an unprecedented request to the court. She asked to be allowed to present a victim impact statement that would recommend a specific sentence for Marcus Thompson. Your Honor, Rebecca said, standing before the packed courtroom, I stand here today not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a healer who has learned something important about the nature of justice and mercy. Marcus Thompson tried to kill me 6 months ago, and if his aim had been better, I wouldn't be here today. But through our subsequent relationship, I've come to understand that sometimes healing requires more than punishment. Rebecca went on to recommend that Marcus be sentenced to community service specifically related to grief counseling and victim advocacy. She proposed that he work with families who had lost loved ones to help them process their grief in healthy ways, preventing others from following the dark path he had taken. Marcus Thompson's greatest punishment isn't prison time, Rebecca concluded. It's having to live with the knowledge that he dishonored his daughter's memory through violence. His greatest redemption would be helping other grieving families find peace without resorting to revenge. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. However, they also recommended mercy in sentencing, citing the unusual circumstances of the case and the victim's extraordinary forgiveness. Judge Williams sentenced Marcus to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years, contingent on his continued participation in mental health treatment and his eventual involvement in grief counseling programs. It was a sentence that satisfied neither the prosecution's demand for maximum punishment nor the defense's hope for minimal jail time. But it reflected the complex nature of a case where traditional concepts of justice seemed inadequate. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he stopped to speak briefly with Rebecca, who had attended every day of the trial. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance you've given me." Rebecca nodded, tears in her eyes. "Honor Sarah's memory," she replied. The 3 years had passed since the shooting on Maple Street when Rebecca Martinez received a letter that would change both her life and Marcus Thompson's forever. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 3 years after Sarah Thompson's death, and it bore the official seal of the Riverside Correctional Facility. Rebecca had continued visiting Marcus during his incarceration, though less frequently, as both of them worked to rebuild their lives. She had returned to her position in the emergency department at Riverside Medical Center, where she had become something of a legend among her colleagues for her extraordinary capacity for forgiveness. She had also begun speaking at medical conferences about the psychological impact of patient deaths on healthcare providers and the importance of supporting families through the grieving process. The letter was from Marcus, but it wasn't his usual update about his counseling sessions or his work in the prison library. This letter contained a proposal that would test the boundaries of redemption and second chances in ways that neither of them had anticipated. "Dear Dr. Martinez," the letter began in Marcus's careful handwriting. "I am writing to ask for your help with something that I believe could honor Sarah's memory while also helping other families avoid the mistakes I made. The prison has approved a proposal for a new grief counseling program, and they've asked me to help design it based on my experiences. I would like to ask if you would consider co-facilitating this program with me." Rebecca read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Marcus was asking her to work alongside him, the man who had tried to kill her, to help other grieving families process their loss in healthy ways. It was an extraordinary request that would require both of them to confront their shared trauma in service of helping others. The grief counseling program that Marcus had proposed was called Sarah's Circle, named in honor of his daughter. The concept was simple but profound. Pair grieving family members with people who had experienced similar losses, while also including healthcare providers who could address medical questions and concerns. The goal was to create a safe space where grief could be processed honestly without transforming into blame or revenge. Marcus had spent his 3 years in prison becoming an expert on the psychology of grief. He had read every book in the prison library on the subject, corresponded with leading researchers in the field, and worked with other inmates who had committed crimes while struggling with loss. His transformation from a man consumed by rage to someone dedicated to helping others heal was remarkable, even to the prison counselors who had initially been skeptical of his motives. Dr. Sandra Reeves, the psychiatrist who had testified at Marcus's trial, had continued working with him throughout his incarceration. She had watched him progress through the stages of grief in a healthy way for the first time since Sarah's death, and she believed that his unique perspective could be valuable in helping others. "Marcus has achieved something extraordinary," Dr. Reeves wrote in a letter supporting the program proposal. "He has taken responsibility for his actions while also learning to channel his grief into positive action. His insights into the dangerous psychological territory that follows traumatic loss could prevent others from making similar destructive choices." Rebecca spent weeks considering Marcus's proposal. The practical challenges were significant: working with an incarcerated felon, navigating prison bureaucracy, and dealing with the inevitable media attention that would follow. But more than that, she had to confront her own feelings about spending extended time with the man who had terrorized her. The answer came during one of her shifts in the emergency department. A father named David Chen brought in his 8-year-old son, who had been struck by a car while riding his bicycle. The boy's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, and the medical team was able to stabilize him quickly. However, Mr. Chen's reaction to the accident was eerily familiar to Rebecca. As his son was being treated, David Chen became increasingly agitated and began demanding to know why certain procedures were taking so long. He questioned every decision made by the medical team and became convinced that his son wasn't receiving adequate care. Rebecca recognized the signs immediately: a parent whose fear and helplessness were transforming into anger and blame. After the boy was successfully treated and admitted for observation, Rebecca spent an hour talking with David Chun about what he was experiencing. She shared her own story about working with grieving families and the importance of processing trauma in healthy ways. By the end of their conversation, Mr. Chun had calmed down significantly and was able to focus on supporting his son's recovery rather than finding fault with his treatment. That night, Rebecca realized that her experience with Marcus had given her unique insights into how medical crises could trigger dangerous psychological responses in family members. She had learned to recognize the warning signs and intervene before fear and helplessness could metastasize into something destructive. She wrote back to Marcus that same evening, accepting his proposal to co-facilitate Sarah's circle. The program launched 6 months later in a small meeting room within the Riverside Correctional Facility. The first session brought together 5 families who had lost children to various tragedies, car accidents, cancer, suicide, and drug overdoses. Rebecca sat across from Marcus at a small table, both of them nervous about how their unusual partnership would be received. Marcus began the session by telling his own story, holding nothing back about his transformation from grieving father to would-be killer to someone committed to helping others heal. He spoke about the months of rage and blame that had nearly destroyed what remained of his life, and about the moment of clarity that had saved both him and Rebecca from an even greater tragedy. "I'm not here as an expert on grief," Marcus said to the assembled families. "I'm here as someone who shows what happens when grief goes wrong, when we let our pain transform into something destructive. My daughter Sarah died 3 years ago, and instead of honoring her memory, I dishonored it by trying to hurt an innocent person who had tried to save her life." Rebecca then spoke about her perspective as a healthcare provider, addressing the medical questions and concerns that often tormented grieving families. She explained how emergency medicine worked, what doctors could and couldn't control, and how medical teams made decisions under pressure. Most importantly, she helped families understand that feeling angry at healthcare providers was normal, but acting on that anger was dangerous. The combination of Marcus's raw honesty about his own destructive choices and Rebecca's clinical expertise created a powerful dynamic. Families felt safe expressing their darkest thoughts and fears because Marcus had already admitted to acting on those same impulses. They trusted Rebecca's medical explanations because she had survived an attack from a grieving father and still chose to help others in similar situations. One of the most impactful moments came when Maria Santos, whose teenage son had died from cancer, admitted that she had been fantasizing about confronting his oncologist with accusations of negligence. "I keep thinking that if Dr. Williams had tried harder, if he had used different treatments, my boy would still be alive," Maria said through tears. "I know it's not rational, but I can't stop thinking about making him pay for failing my son." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I had those same thoughts about Dr. Martinez. I convinced myself that she hadn't tried hard enough to save Sarah, that she had given up too soon. Those thoughts felt so real, so justified, that I acted on them. I nearly destroyed 2 more lives because I couldn't accept that sometimes terrible things happen despite everyone's best efforts." Rebecca added her medical perspective, explaining how cancer treatment worked and why some cases couldn't be cured regardless of the skill or dedication of the medical team. She helped Maria understand that her son's doctor had almost certainly done everything possible to save his life. "The hardest truth about medicine is that we can't save everyone," Rebecca said. "But that doesn't mean we don't care, and it doesn't mean we don't try our absolute best every single time." By the end of that first session, Maria had agreed to participate in a role-playing exercise where she would have a constructive conversation with her son's oncologist instead of a confrontational one. 2 weeks later, she reported back to the group that the conversation had brought her peace rather than more pain. Sarah's circle quickly gained national attention as an innovative approach to grief counseling. The program's unique partnership between a crime victim and her former attacker challenged conventional wisdom about justice and redemption. Media outlets struggled to categorize the story. Was it about criminal rehabilitation, medical ethics, or the power of forgiveness? Rebecca found herself fielding interview requests from major news networks and academic researchers. She was invited to speak at conferences around the country about trauma recovery and restorative justice. But she always insisted that Marcus receive equal credit for the program's success, despite his incarcerated status. This program works because it's honest about the dark places that grief can take us, Rebecca told a reporter from 60 Minutes. Marcus doesn't sugarcoat what happened to him or pretend that his actions were justified. He shows other grieving families where that path leads, and he helps them choose a different direction. The program expanded to include video conferences with other correctional facilities, allowing Marcus to work with grieving families across the country. Prison officials, initially skeptical about allowing an inmate to counsel people from the outside world, became strong supporters of the program as they saw its positive impact on both participants and Marcus himself. After 18 months of operation, Sarah's Circle had helped over 200 families process their grief without resorting to blame or revenge. The program had prevented at least 3 potential attacks on healthcare providers, according to participant testimonials. More importantly, it had given families tools to honor their loved ones' memories through positive action rather than destructive impulses. Marcus became eligible for parole after serving 5 years of his sentence, 2 years earlier than originally scheduled, due to his exceptional participation in rehabilitation programs and his work with Sarah's Circle. His parole hearing drew significant media attention, with victim advocates on both sides of the issue. Rebecca testified at the hearing in support of Marcus's release, arguing that he had transformed himself into someone who could make a positive contribution to society. She proposed that he be released under strict supervision to work full-time developing grief counseling programs. The Marcus Thompson who attacked me 5 years ago no longer exists, Rebecca told the parole board. That man was consumed by rage and pain and the inability to accept his daughter's death. The man sitting before you today has learned to channel that same pain into helping others heal. He has become exactly the kind of person his daughter Sarah would want him to be. The parole board approved Marcus's release by a unanimous vote, with the conditions that he continue his mental health treatment and expand his work with Sarah's Circle. His release date was set for March 15th, exactly 5 years after his daughter's death. On the morning of his release, Marcus walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility carrying a single cardboard box containing letters from the families he had counseled and a framed photograph of Sarah that Rebecca had given him during one of her visits. He was met by Rebecca, who had taken the day off work to drive him to his new apartment and help him begin his transition back to civilian life. They drove in comfortable silence for the first few miles, both of them processing the enormity of what had happened over the past 5 years. Marcus had entered prison as a broken man consumed by rage and emerged as someone dedicated to preventing others from making his mistakes. Rebecca had transformed from a trauma victim into a national advocate for restorative justice and grief counseling. "Are you nervous?" Rebecca asked as they pulled into the parking lot of Marcus's apartment complex. Terrified, Marcus admitted, but also hopeful. "For the first time since Sarah died, I feel like I have a purpose again. Not the same purpose I had before, but something meaningful." Rebecca helped Marcus carry his few possessions up to his small one-bedroom apartment, which had been furnished through donations from Sarah's Circle supporters. On the kitchen table was a welcome basket from his neighbors and a folder containing job offers from 3 different organizations that wanted to hire him to develop grief counseling programs. As they sat at the kitchen table reviewing his options, Rebecca noticed a new photograph that Marcus had placed beside the one of Sarah. It was a picture from one of their Sarah's Circle sessions, showing Marcus and Rebecca working together with a group of grieving families. In the photo, both of them were smiling, surrounded by people who had found hope in their shared story of trauma and redemption. "Thank you," Marcus said suddenly, looking directly at Rebecca. "Not just for forgiving me or helping with the program, but for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You saved my life in more ways than one." Rebecca reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture she had made 5 years earlier when he was sobbing on the pavement after firing 5 shots at her. "We saved each other," she replied. "Sarah's death brought us together in the worst possible way, but it also gave us the chance to show that healing is always possible, even after the most terrible things happen." Outside the apartment window, Spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the small garden that Marcus would tend as part of his transition program. Somewhere across town, another grieving family was struggling with loss and looking for someone to blame. And, in a small meeting room at Riverside Correctional Facility, a new group of Sarah's Circle participants were learning that there was a different path through grief, a path that led to healing rather than destruction. The 5 shots that Marcus Thompson had fired on that March morning 5 years earlier had missed their intended target, but they had hit something else entirely. They had shattered 2 lives and then, unexpectedly, created the foundation for something beautiful and redemptive. Sarah Thompson's death had meaning now, not because it was justified or necessary, but because it had inspired others to choose love over hatred, healing over revenge, and hope over despair. Marcus and Rebecca would continue their work together for many years to come, helping thousands of families navigate the treacherous waters of grief without losing their way in darkness. Their story became a testament to the possibility of redemption, proving that even the worst moments in human experience can become the seeds of extraordinary healing and growth. Sarah's Circle would eventually expand to operate in 47 states, with Marcus serving as its national director and Rebecca as its chief medical advisor. Together, they had created something that honored not just Sarah Thompson's memory, but the memory of every person whose death had the potential to either destroy or transform the lives of those left behind. The choice, they learned, was always theirs to make. Tease all any of us can do. The trial made national news, sparking debates about grief, justice, and the possibility of redemption even after the most serious crimes. Legal experts disagreed about whether Rebecca's forgiveness should have influenced the sentence, but most agreed that the case highlighted important questions about how society should respond to violence born from mental health crises. For Rebecca, the trial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had faced her attacker in court and chosen mercy over vengeance, but the real work of healing was just beginning. The trauma of that morning on Maple Street would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. Marcus began serving his sentence at Riverside Correctional Facility, where he immediately enrolled in every available counseling and education program. He also began corresponding with other families who had lost children, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting grief transform into something destructive. The case of Marcus Thompson and Dr. Rebecca Martinez would be studied in law schools and psychology programs for years to come, not just for its legal precedents, but for its demonstration of the possibility of healing even after the most traumatic experiences. It was a story that challenged conventional wisdom about victims and perpetrators, showing that sometimes the path to justice runs through forgiveness rather than revenge. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "You'll face criminal charges, probably attempted murder. You could go to prison for a long time." "I deserve it," Marcus said. "I tried to kill an innocent person. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." Rebecca found herself disagreeing, though she couldn't fully explain why. Yes, Marcus had committed a serious crime and needed to face consequences for his actions. But she had seen too much human suffering in her medical career to believe that punishment alone could heal the kind of damage that loss and grief could inflict on the human psyche. "Maybe," she said carefully, "what you deserve is a chance to honor Sarah's memory in a way that would make her proud. Maybe what we both need is to find some way to make sense of all this pain." The conversation continued for another hour, 2 strangers brought together by tragedy, trying to find some path forward that didn't involve destroying what remained of their lives. When visiting time ended, Rebecca promised to return the following day. She wasn't sure why she was making that commitment, but something told her that both their healing processes were just beginning. "Grief," Rebecca answered simply. "Just grief that got twisted into something it was never meant to be." As Steve cleaned the cuts on her face and checked for signs of concussion, Rebecca never let go of Marcus Thompson's hand. Despite everything he had done, despite the terror he had put her through, she understood that he was a victim too. Sarah's death had claimed 2 lives that March night, even though only one body had been carried away from the hospital. The investigation would take hours, the paperwork would take days, and the legal proceedings would take months. But the real healing, for both Marcus and Rebecca, would take much longer than any of that. They had been brought together by violence and tragedy, but something else was growing between them now, something that neither had expected and both desperately needed. As Marcus was helped to his feet and placed in the back of a police cruiser, he looked back at Rebecca one final time. The hatred was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like gratitude. She had given him something he hadn't even known he needed: permission to grieve properly, to remember Sarah with love instead of anger, to find a way forward that honored his daughter's memory without destroying his own life. The gun remained on the pavement where it had fallen, 5 spent shell casings scattered around it like deadly confetti. 5 shots that had changed everything, that had brought a grieving father to the end of his rope, and a dedicated doctor face to face with the unexpected consequences of trying to save lives in a world that didn't always want to be saved. Rated the positive potential inherent in competitive challenges. Rather than creating lasting resentment, Sarah's victory had catalyzed growth and development that made both fighters more effective than they had been individually. Months later, the evaluation between Sarah and Marcus would be remembered as a watershed moment in Fort Braxton's training history. The confrontation had not just determined individual supremacy, but had demonstrated the value of technical excellence and strategic thinking in military combat effectiveness. Sarah's 3-second victory over the base's toughest soldier had become the stuff of legend, a moment of pure technical brilliance that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. More importantly, it had established principles and standards that would influence training methodologies and tactical thinking throughout the military. The story of how a small woman with exceptional skills defeated a larger, stronger opponent through superior technique and strategic preparation became a powerful illustration of the potential inherent in dedication, preparation, and technical excellence. Sarah's victory proved that with proper training and strategic thinking, apparent disadvantages could be transformed into decisive advantages. The legacy of that historic afternoon extended far beyond the personal achievements of the individual participants. Sarah's demonstration of technical excellence had elevated standards and expectations throughout Fort Braxton, inspiring countless soldiers to pursue higher levels of skill and tactical sophistication. The 3 seconds that changed everything had become a defining moment not just for Sarah and Marcus, but for everyone who witnessed the power of preparation, technique, and strategic thinking to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The lesson would endure long after the participants had moved on to other assignments and challenges, a testament to the transformative potential of excellence pursued with dedication and intelligence.